I'm very pleased and honored, and these are not just formal words, I really think so, to open this event, the Dubin Lecture, which is our annual event in which we bring a very interesting speaker to talk about Israel, the Middle East, and things like that. And luckily, we are having today the ambassador of Israel, who has been here for a year. I didn't realize that you've been here for such a long time. But why doesn't Bonnie sit there? Yeah. Right. So I'm Yoram Perry, the K Chair in Israel Studies and the Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. And it's really given me great pleasure. What we do here, we teach 15 or 16 courses on Israel. We have about between 500 and 600 students, both undergraduate and graduates. We're involved in research. We are the publishers and the editors of the Journal of Israel Studies. We do activities beyond the academic, pure academic, the classes. And we do other things which are more public education, events, cultural events. We had a wonderful play 2 weeks ago which drew about 300 people, a fantastic Israeli play called Oh God. And the story was about God who decided that he's fed up with his job, he's depressed, he needs a shrink. So he went to the shrink, a female shrink, and they had a wonderful conversation. It was a fantastic event. We do other things which are more related to politics, because we have to understand the Middle East. And for example, this year, I just said that earlier, we have brought to our center 2 distinguished Israelis. One is a professor of law who is teaching a course on the fight against terrorism and the international law. The other one is a journalist who covered Gaza for 20 years. And he knows the Gazan people and the Hamas more than anybody else, probably more than any intelligent unit in the world. But our approach is really different than the approach that is taken in other universities. We are trying to deepen the understanding of the Middle East. We cooperate with other faculties and other centers in the university, the Persian Center, the Sadat Chair, and we try to see the complexity of the Middle East. And not only the conflict. We teach courses in Israeli politics, Israeli society, history, and also culture. So today I want to present to you, because we want to save as much time as possible for our talk, I want to present to you a new project that we started last year. Again, with the great idea of the children of Alma and Joe, and that was an initiative to support a student who takes minor studies with a grant. So in a few minutes, I'm going to call Michelle Thomas. Is she here? Where is she? All right. She's the first recipient of the new Gildenhorn Family Scholarship, which was an initiative of Michael and Catherine Gildenhorn, together with Carol and Michael, 2 Michaels in the family, winner, in honor of their parents. The endowment scholarship is awarded annually to an outstanding student pursuing a minor in Israel studies. We have more than 25 students this year, and I'm sure that we're going to enlarge the number, as well as other fields. For example, we started a year ago also a graduate program, and we're having 4 students in different fields: history, political science, literature. So Michelle is a junior who pursue a double major, you will be surprised, in biochemistry and psychology and neurology, in addition to minor in Israel studies. Unfortunately, she doesn't have an hour to explain to us how it goes together, but she will tell us a few words about her experience in this field and would recommend other students who are here to take the program, which she thinks, I guess, is a wonderful program. So, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Michelle Thomas, and I'm an undergraduate student here at the University of Maryland. Like it was mentioned, I major in biochemistry and in neurobiology, and I minor in Israel studies and religious studies. I've been told it's a weird combination. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Michael and Kathy Gildenhorn and Carol and Michael Weiner for their generosity in creating the Gildenhorn Family Scholarship for Israel Studies. It is an honor to be the first recipient of this award, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say thank you in such a public way. Receiving this scholarship greatly helped me to finance my study abroad experience last semester in Israel. For 4 months, I studied at the University of Haifa, and I explored different places all across the country. I hiked Maktash Ramon, and I went camping in the Upper Galilee. I stood outside Dizengoff House on Yom Ha'atzmaut, and I got to have a cookout with my new friends on Lag BaOmer. So I'm proud to have taken advantage of every opportunity to explore Israel, and I will always cherish my memories of my first visit, and I'm certain that it won't be my last. Studying abroad in Israel, it may seem an obvious choice for an Israel Studies minor, but my path to Israel was not always so clear. I started school as a biochemistry major, minoring in religious studies, and my interest in religious studies, it was focused on the origins of religion and in theology. But it wasn't until I took a class here on religion and politics in the state of Israel that I began to appreciate the role that religion plays in today's world. My professor, Dr. Joseph Ringel, was the most engaging teacher that I have had at a class here, and I was encouraged to continue with the subject. The following semester, I took a class with Professor Paul Sham, and in this class, the 20 members of our student body, we assumed the roles of Jewish and Arab leaders of the 1930s and reenacted a simulation of negotiating with one another and petitioning the Peel Commission with our aspirations. I've never taken a class that so immersed its students in the narratives and worldviews of both sides of the conflict, and I was encouraged us so much to think creatively. To all of the students here tonight who will be registering for classes soon, I suggest that you take a look at what the Gildenhorn Institute of Israel Studies has to offer. I believe that the program comprises some of the most inspiring teachers and some of the most innovative courses offered at the University of Maryland. We are really so fortunate to have this institute here on our campus. Just once more, I'd like to thank the Gildenhorn family for creating this special scholarship for Israel Studies minors. I feel so privileged to be the first of many recipients. It's scholarships like this that really enable other students to pursue our academic dreams. So thank you again, and I look forward to hearing the ambassador's lecture.
Thank you, Michelle. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Bonnie Thornton-Deal, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and a professor of women's studies. She is a pioneering scholar studying the intersection of race, class, and gender in the United States, with an emphasis on African-American women, work, and families. Prior to assuming the position of a dean, Dr. Deal chaired the Women's Studies Department for 8 years in this university. She holds the title of a founding director of both the Center for Research on Women at the University of Memphis and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. Dr. Deal was the president of the National Women's Studies Association some years ago, and prior to that, she was a vice president of the American Sociological Association. Professor Deal has received recognition as an outstanding scholar, teacher, and institution builder, and I can speak for half an hour about all these things that she's done, but she is really the chief champion in advocating, indeed, implementing so many values that are dear to us all: diversity, and pluralism, global and critic and civic engagement, social entrepreneurship, and I might even use a word in Hebrew, tikkun olam. She's really a believer and she does practice how to mend the world. So, Dean Deal, the floor is yours. She disappeared.
No, I'm right here. Thank you, Yoram. I'm so pleased to be here at this 6th annual Dubin Lecture, and I do want to say that although Dick and Liz Dubin, who are the sponsors of this, could not be here with us this evening, we're very grateful to them and really very much appreciate their support of this event. This series is an important occasion in the life of the College of Arts and Humanities at Maryland, a college that is distinguished both by its location close to the nation's capital and its mission of developing global citizens. As people equipped to be global citizens, our students gain, as you just heard, in-depth cultural, historical, and linguistic knowledge in their field of study, and they are equipped to use their skills of critical analysis to engage in the world and contribute to the solution of social problems. The Dubin Lecture is one of the most established and distinguished events that help us achieve these goals. This series brings students and faculty together across disciplines and outside the classroom to discuss and inquire about some of the most important, timely, and thorny issues concerning Israel and the Middle East today. The process of wrestling with challenging problems for which there are no easy answers helps our students develop vibrant and flexible minds and prepares them for, as we say on campus, the real world. So I am proud to say that the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies embraces these opportunities, and it's been my pleasure during my term as dean to watch its continued growth and development. I don't know how many of you know this, but Professor Perry and his colleague, Professor Paul Sham, are the editors of the Israel Studies Journal, the cross-disciplinary academic publication of the Association for Israel Studies. As the journal's editors, they play a meaningful leadership role in the field of Israel Studies, and bringing the journal to campus has added prestige and respect to the program and also a lot of work. The journal is one of the many points of pride for the Gildenhorn Institute, and this event is another. So I've consistently been impressed with the high quality of this lecture series. Tonight marks the 6th annual Dubin Lecture, and over the years, the Gildenhorn Institute, under the dynamic leadership of Yoram Perry, has taken full advantage of its near DC location, hosting a wide range of prominent speakers who help us understand and think in new ways about long-term issues in the Middle East. Past speakers have included Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, and last year's guest, Jane Harmon, former member of Congress and president of the Wilson Institute. The series has also hosted 2 previous Israeli ambassadors, and this evening we have the special opportunity to host the 3rd. So it's my great honor to introduce the 2014 speaker, Ambassador Ron Dermer. Ron Dermer was appointed Israeli ambassador to the United States in July of 2013. He previously served as senior advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. From 2007 to 2011, Ambassador Dermer served as Israel's economic envoy to the United States under Ariel Sharon. He grew up in Florida and began his political life working with Natan Sharansky. In 2004, Dermer and Sharansky co-authored a best-selling book entitled The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror. Ambassador Dermer is a member of the Likud party and remains a close advisor and consultant to Mr. Netanyahu. He and his wife have 5 children and live in Jerusalem. This evening, Ambassador Dermer will discuss the current state of affairs in Israel and the Middle East. I am confident in having had the opportunity to listen to him talk just briefly. I know that this widely read and very intelligent man, that his knowledge of current engagements his talk will be both timely and informative. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dermer.
Thank you. Well, no place for it, but first things first. Great win against Penn State. I'm still suffering as a long-standing University of Miami football fan, that loss we had to Penn State 18 years ago. So when everyone can go into Penn State and win, gives us a little bit of nachas down in South Florida. Before I speak, I think it's important to recognize that today is a very difficult day in Israel, not just because of the events that we've seen in Jerusalem, but this is the day 19 years ago when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. And it's a day of national mourning in Israel. I remember that I was a student when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. I was at Oxford University, and I remember a fellow Israeli-born student who rushed in my room and told me that Rabin had been shot. And the feeling I had that day, my stomach just dropped. It actually felt like somebody had just delivered this horrific punch to me. And we didn't have television, let alone cell phones, in those days in our rooms. And we went into the elevator to ride down to watch it in the one room where they had a television. And I just hoped and prayed two things. First of all, that he would live, because we didn't know at the time, and somebody who had dedicated his life to serving the state of Israel. He was an ambassador in Washington, but that was probably the least important role that he played in the life of the state of Israel as our chief of staff and defense minister and, of course, prime minister. And the second hope was that it wasn't a Jew who did this. I kept thinking to myself over and over and over and over again. And, of course, as the night wore on, I realized that neither of those hopes or prayers would come true, and that a Jew had actually killed the prime minister of a Jewish state. And that's something that today I think anybody who thinks about Israel, studies Israel, wants to understand Israel, have to understand how traumatic of an event that is. We're a very old people, the Jewish people, but we've had very few days like that where somebody would actually lift a gun and a Jew would kill a Jewish prime minister of Israel. So I want to say that before anything else on this particular day. I want to thank President Lowe. Where is he? I know, is he in the back? They put you on the side there, and they can't give you a front row seat. You're the president, for crying out loud. And Dean Dill, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm everything but a member of the Likud party. I'm actually not a member of any party in Israel, but I appreciate the introduction. And I want to thank the Gildenhorns for establishing an Israel Studies Center that I understand is the largest in the country. It requires a great act of prescience, of being able to see where your investment is going to make a difference. And from what I can see and what I've heard, this investment has made a huge difference in the future. And I thank you very much for everything that you have done to make this a leading Israel Studies program in the United States. Now, as ambassador of Israel, I get to speak about all sorts of issues all the time. And we talk about Iran and the peace process. And I know we're going to have questions and answers, and you can ask me all the questions you want to ask me, the difficult questions. If you want to ask me easy questions, I'll take those too. But today, because this is an Israel Studies Center, I want to talk about things that I think you won't necessarily read about in the paper, or a speech that I won't necessarily give to some other audience, but a speech that hopefully will, or a lecture that hopefully will provide you with greater insight and understanding into Israel. Because this is a place where you study Israel, and I think there are things that sometimes are lost. And what I want to talk about is something you won't necessarily hear in your lecture, or you won't read about in the book, but that an outsider to Israel observing our country should know. Now, I speak somewhat as an authoritative outsider, because I was born and raised, as you can hear by my non-Polish accented English, I was born and raised in this country, in Miami. And I came to Israel at the age of at 25. So I see Israel still, despite having lived there for 17, 18 years, and I served a brief stint as economic attaché here in the United States, and this is my second stint in diplomatic service. I see Israel through the eyes of an outsider, as a former American looking at Israel. And all I can say, for what it's worth, you have to decide whether these insights are valuable or not. But just remember, the greatest book ever written about America was written by a Frenchman. And if you don't know what that book is, then I have another assignment for you. But there are three things that I think are underestimated in terms of their importance in Israel and in understanding Israel. The first is the size of the country, the very small size of the country. The second is the unique political culture that Israel has. And the third is a powerful sense of solidarity that you have in Israel that you won't necessarily have in other countries. And it's hard for people to understand that looking from the outside. So let me speak about the first one. I know people think that the greatest problem in the Middle East is that Israel's too big. But Israel is a very, very small country. America is 500 times the size of Israel. The Arab world is 500 times the size of Israel. Egypt is 50 times the size of Israel. What that means is that issues that would otherwise be tactical issues for other countries, tactical threats to other countries, become strategic threats to a country like Israel. You know, when you have rockets being fired at your cities, as we did this last summer for 50 days, people can look at that from the outside and say, oh, you have all these short-range rockets being fired into the country. If it were the United States, that could be a problem if it were coming from Mexico in San Diego or in San Antonio, maybe if they had long enough, slightly longer range in Key West, but it's not a problem for the country. It's not a strategic challenge to the United States. But in Israel it is, because it means that our airports can be within range. It means our strategic installations, national refineries, military bases, sensitive facilities in the country, and certainly your major population centers are within the range of very short-range rockets. 80% of our population. We had during the war, we had between 2/3 and 3/4 of our population at some point during the war in bomb shelters. That's the equivalent of over 200 million Americans. So it's a different problem when you are a very, very small country. And of course, because Israel is so tiny, threats that would otherwise not seem to be a strategic threat, like tunnels, digging tunnels in a country. How much of that would be a threat to the United States if people were digging in tunnels from Mexico? It would be a threat to some communities. But because Israel is packed in, because it is so small, it becomes a much more dramatic threat. I'll actually speak about that if you want to stay and listen. Now, of course, if you want to understand the nature of the threat, realize that it takes you about 2 to 4 minutes to fly a plane over the width of Israel. It takes you 6 hours to go from New York to California. It'll take you about 4 minutes in a commercial flight. In an F-16, it'll happen much faster than that. Now, that affects a lot of things of how you strategically defend the country. And one of the issues that is not thought about is we think about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, which is by far the greatest threat that Israel faces by orders of magnitude, is that Israel is not a big country. One of the moderates, so-called moderates in Iran, once said a few years ago that Israel is a one-bomb country. And maybe if Israel were 500 times its size, maybe we would look at the threat of Iran very differently. But because of our history and because of our size, it makes a big difference. And in the public debate around Israel, you see very little focus on the physical size of the country. Now, to be a small country can be very dangerous. Now, if you're in a nice neighborhood and you're a small country, it's not that bad. You got Monaco. That's not that bad. They're small. Belgium, not bad. But you see they've got better neighbors. You got Holland, you got Luxembourg. Not too threatening. If you're small in a good neighborhood, it's okay. But we don't have Holland and Luxembourg as neighbors. And remember, when Belgium, tiny Belgium, had a powerful neighbor in Nazi Germany, That small country was very, very threatened. And you have to look at Israel's neighbors and look at the threats that it faces around it to understand the security challenges that we face. Just go around the horn. We have in the north, we have Syria, where Assad, and with help from Hezbollah and Iran, has killed 200,000 Syrians, a humanitarian catastrophe, an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. And he controls 25% of his country. And then you have all sorts of substates in Syria. You've got Alawistan, which is Assad's specific sect that he belongs to within Syria. You've got a Druze area. You've got a Kurdish area. And then you've got the Sunni area also subdivided in all sorts of groups. And al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, all sorts of groups fighting in Syria, where the whole state has basically collapsed. And all the security challenges that happen from that. And then you have in Lebanon. We've got in Lebanon Hezbollah. After Israel withdrew to the 1967 borders, Hezbollah strengthened itself and now has 100,000 strong rocket arsenal pointed at Israel. Hamas at the beginning of the last war had 10,000 rockets. Hezbollah is 10 times the threat, at least 10 times the threat that Hamas is. And that's in the north. In the south, Gaza, I don't have to go into that too much. Everyone saw the threat that can come from Gaza, which is only about 5% of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. That's about 5%. It's a little thumb. And you see what kind of threat that you can have from such a little territory that's contiguous to Israel because, again, we're very small. Then you have in the Sinai. We have a situation in Sinai where over the last few years you've seen a collapse and a deterioration of the security where it became a virtual Wild West. Now, under Mubarak understood that there was a problem. He didn't act. Morsi didn't see a lot of those terror groups as problems. He saw them as partners. So he certainly didn't act. And Sisi, the new president of Egypt, is acting. And he's acting in a very powerful way. And he's confronting the Islamist terror organizations within Sinai. And it's made a big difference, but it's a fight. And those of you who follow the news closely know that just about 10 days ago, 36 Egyptian soldiers were killed. But there's a real battle going on. And then, of course, you have the situation that we have in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. That right now in Jerusalem has become a problem. But don't forget, the reason why you've had a relatively stable situation happen in the West Bank was because Israel launched a massive military operation 12 years ago. It was called Operation Defensive Shield. And after a year and a half of absorbing wave after wave of terror attacks, Israel had this funny idea that a good way to confront terrorism is actually to confront it and to fight it. And we went in with our military into these cities where we had these suicide bombings, you remember, on buses and cafes and discos. Israel had to go in and clear it out. And it took a long time. And we paid a price. Civilians, 1,000 Israelis were killed. Soldiers who died because we didn't just carpet bomb from the air. A lot of countries do that. We don't. We sent our soldiers into hornets' nests of terrorism to try to actually keep civilians on the other side out of harm's way. But we were able to basically lower that terrorism threat, to dismantle that infrastructure and put up a security fence to prevent these attacks. But that was the situation that we had. Now, all that, what I just told you, that doesn't even deal with ISIS or even with the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. So you see the threat environment that Israel faces, and the first thing you have to remember is that Israel is a very, very small country. Now, most people have the idea to advance peace. They say, let's do mutually agreed land swaps. So I have a slightly different idea. It's called mutually agreed neighbor swaps. So we're taking Canada, and we're giving you Syria. And we'll take Mexico, and you can take your pick. Now, interesting, by the way, nobody wants to do that deal with me except for people who live in states that border New Jersey. I've noticed that. I had to take a dig because my predecessor, who was the first American-born ambassador, he's from New Jersey, so I can't. He said it was more difficult for him to defend New Jersey in America than it was to defend Israel. But the bottom line is people have to understand when thinking about Israel that because of our size, we don't have margins for error. We can't make big mistakes. When you're blessed, as Kissinger, I think, once said, with Canada in the north and Mexico in the south and fish for neighbors, You can afford to make mistakes. Israel can't afford to make many mistakes. We can't afford to lose a single war. We don't have another chance. And when you leave Lebanon and you withdraw to a 67 line, you end up not with a hand outstretched for peace. You end up with Hezbollah and 100,000 rockets and in a forward Iranian terror base. And when you leave Gaza and you do exactly what the international community says, we did the template there. Go back to the 1967 lines, remove all the settlements, and give the keys to President Abu Mazen. Been there, done that. It's called Gaza. And we've had 3 rounds and about 20,000 rockets fired at us from there. So now you're dealing with a challenge. Well, what do you do in the West Bank? What type of an agreement can you make? And you can be sure that Israelis are very, very concerned. Now, they don't know much about baseball, but somehow the concept of 3 strikes and you're out has made it in translation. They get that. And when the Prime Minister of Israel makes a demand that I cannot withdraw unless I have ironclad security arrangements on the ground, unique security arrangements that will protect the peace and protect Israel if the peace unravels, these are real concerns. They're not obstacles to peace. They're the only way you get to a peace. Israel can't make an agreement that where we withdraw from these territories, strategically important territories, without having security arrangements in place that are unique. Now, sometimes the response to that is, look, if you leave Israeli forces, if you leave a long-term Israeli military presence along the Jordan River, as my Prime Minister has said many times, you're continuing what's called the occupation. Then the Palestinians will not be a sovereign state. You can't do that. If you have military forces there, they won't be a sovereign state. Well, is Japan a sovereign state? I know they don't have the history of the great state of Palestine, but Japan is a pretty serious state. And they've had American military forces there for 70 years. Is Germany a serious state? Is South Korea a serious state? What's not serious is the idea that Israel is just going to get up and walk out of these territories and hope for the best. That's not a serious position. It's not a serious position for people who want peace. A serious position is to say, look, Israel has real security needs, they need to be addressed, and we have to think about models of sovereignty that enable Israel to have the margins that it needs to protect its country. Because we face an existential challenge. And it shouldn't be dismissed. So the first thing out of everything is size of the country. And I have to say, there was a sign that said, end assistance for Israel. One of the things about being a small country is that you may have a very high GDP per capita, which we have. It's very high. Actually, we're beyond the EU average, and we're just behind Hong Kong and Singapore. And we may catch them, depending on what our growth rates are. So people say, well, why do you need military assistance? Well, the problem is we only have 8 million people. If we were 80 million people, with half that GDP per capita, then we would have enormous resources to provide for our defense needs. But the reason why we need help and why we deeply appreciate the fact that the United States has helped share this enormous burden that we carry is because we're a small population with huge defense needs. And we appreciate it, as I said, that the United States for decades has helped Israel shoulder this tremendous burden. Where size, I should say, is silver lining to this cloud, size helps in innovation. Being small as a country helps in innovation. Because in Israel, you can take, in a very small area, its military, its academy, and its business sector, and put them all in a very small cluster. And because you have synergies between these different groups, you can create a marvel, like in Israel. It won't happen everywhere. It's not the main reason because we're small. It has something to do with chutzpah, but that's for a lecture on chutzpah. It takes chutzpah for 4 Israelis to say, well, Apple made that and Microsoft made this. We can do a better job. It's chutzpah that drives Israeli innovation. But chutzpah in a small country is better than chutzpah in a big country for innovation. And you look in one of the areas where this is all coming together is Beersheba. Beersheba is an area that is going to be one of the leading places of cyber in the world. If you have a takeaway from this lecture, buy something in Beersheba, anything. Trust me, it'll go up many, many times over. Buy an apartment, buy a parking lot, buy anything you want in Beersheba. And the reason why it's going to go up is because what Israel's doing is we're taking our military intelligence, which is not an oxymoron in Israel. We're taking our military intelligence and we're moving it down to Beersheba. A lot of it is in areas that are in population centers, and there's no reason for them to be in the center of the country. You don't need to put Pentagon in Times Square. We're moving it down to Beersheba. And Israel has a fairly big intelligence apparatus. We have a first-class university in Ben Gurion University, and we're establishing business incubators in this area. And a lot of businesses want to come in to get access to these brains and this brain power and dynamism in Israel. So the small size of the country actually helps you. So the first thing when you're thinking about Israel is remember it's a small country, and this has huge implications for our security. I think it was Charles Krauthammer who said, the major problem for Israel's public diplomacy is the weather report. Because you see on your screen, you know, the United States, and it looks like this, and then you see Israel, and it fits in the same screen. And people don't understand. We are 1/500th of the size of the United States. And that has a greater impact on so many of the challenges that we face than almost anything else. The second thing is the unique, really, I think, unique political culture that you have in Israel. First of all, it's the system in Israel. This is another takeaway should have. Any of you go on into public life, become elected officials, never adopt Israel's political system. If it's not the worst in the world, then I guarantee you we're in the top 3. It didn't work for the Jews in the Weimar Republic, and it doesn't quite work for us in Israel. And what it is a system, if you don't know, of proportional representation. Israelis go, they don't vote for individuals in elections, they vote for parties. In fact, there's no Hebrew word for accountability. That may be the reason why. You don't have an individual who you're voting for. You go in and you vote for a party, and if your party gets 2.5% or 3% of the vote, they get 3% of the seats. You know, you get 10% of the vote in the Israeli election, Party X, they get 10% of our 120-seat parliament, 12 seats. That's how the system works. So people always try to sort of glorify a political system and say, no, this is natural to, it's not natural. People decided to do it because before the founding of Israel, this type of system lets everybody have a voice. And Israel's a system where everybody has a voice. And there's a lot of noise because there's a lot of voices. But if you took the same system in the United States, imagine you go into an election, you don't vote for a candidate, you vote for a party. How many parties do you think you'd have in the United States that would get over 2.5% of the vote? Think about it. You might have a religious right party. You might have an African American party. You might have an Hispanic party. You might have a pro-choice party, a pro-life party. You might have a labor union party. You might have also, you'd probably have 10, 12, 14 parties. You wouldn't have 2 big parties. You'd have a mess. So as bad as you think your political system is, broken as you think it might be, let me tell you, all you need to do is take Israel's system for a couple of years. You guys will kiss the ground in Washington and thank God for the system that you have. But what happens is an Israeli prime minister gets elected. He has to then cobble together a coalition from all of these different parties. There's never been a party in Israel's history that's gotten a majority of 61 seats in the parliament, ever. Right now, does anyone know what's the largest party in the Knesset, how many seats they have? Anyone know? 19, very good. That's single jeopardy. Who said that? Excellent. 19 seats. It's actually not the prime minister's party. Prime minister ran with someone else in a union in a party, got 31. But right now, because of quirks in Israel, the prime minister's party has 18. Another party, Yair Lapid, who's our minister of finance, he has 19 seats. 19 seats out of 120. So what you need to do as prime minister is you have to make all sorts of trades and compromises in order to build a coalition. And people in Israel's government are not in your party. Many of the leaders in Israel's government are from different parties. The old joke in Israel used to be that the main job of the foreign minister of the state of Israel would be to try to become prime minister of the state of Israel. Because a lot of times he was from a different party, or maybe he was in the same party and he's a rival. But you don't control all the portfolios. Right now, the major portfolios in Israel the cabinet posts are, finance, foreign, defense, and prime minister. Of those four, the prime minister has two in his party. One of them is a rival party, the foreign minister, and as I said, Yair Lapid is another one. So understand when the prime minister is trying to govern, this thing that it makes it so wonderful for representation and everybody has a voice, makes it very difficult to govern. And not only that, every Monday, the prime minister has to show up for a vote of confidence. That makes a big difference. Now imagine that President Obama would have to show up every Monday to Congress to get a vote of confidence in his leadership. You think he'd govern the same way? No. So when you're looking at decision-making in Israel, when you're studying decision-making in Israel, understand, look, a prime minister has to focus on two or three things. And he's got to make a lot of compromises, all sorts of compromises, in order to achieve those two or three things. If he spends his time fighting over every issue, he won't get through the first week. And that affects his ability to lead the country. So what to the outside world may look as something very small, do this confidence-building measure, do this little step, why don't you do this? It can create enormous turbulence. And a prime minister who actually wants to achieve something for the country should never risk his government for something that's not one of those two or three most important priorities he faces. And I think that's one of the reasons why historically a lot of our agreements were first negotiated in secret. Because you have so much turbulence in coalition politics in Israel, you actually have secret agreements that then have to be presented to the public when they're fully cooked. But the process of cooking them can be very, very complicated. And the person who best understood this, more than anyone else, I have to say, is Vice President Joe Biden. He actually summed up Israel's political problem that it has. It was in this famous visit that he came to Israel in May 2010, and we had a bit of a crisis with building in Ramat Shlomo, a Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, that it became a big event. If I had a nickel for every crisis in the U.S.-Israel relations, I would be a very wealthy man. Believe me, we don't have a crisis in our relations. But then there was another one of these so-called crises. But before that, there was lunch with the vice president and the prime minister, and I was there, and the prime minister was explaining to him this system that I just explained to you, that what you think is a small thing that's not relevant can be a very big deal. And when you ask me to bring peace to my public, that's one thing. Then I have something real. But don't assume that for this little step that won't necessarily get us to where we want to go, that you're going to risk the whole apple cart. And the vice president said, well, Mr. Prime Minister, you remind me of what Joe Biden Sr. always used to say. Never crucify yourself on a small cross. Now, think about that. First of all, I was rolling, the prime minister was rolling, but just the whole scene of a Catholic vice president and a Jewish prime minister crucifying yourself on a small cross. But I'm telling you, if you want to understand Israeli decision makers, you don't sacrifice or crucify yourself on a small cross. Israeli prime ministers stand on big crosses, and they make big decisions, and they can do that, and then the politics doesn't matter. You change coalitions, you go to elections, you do what you're going to do, but you stand on something real. But what could be perceived as a small step from the outside ends up being a very big step. Second issue about Israel's politics. The politicians, I'll ask this way. How many politicians, where's the guy who answered my first question? All right. It's double jeopardy. All right. How many political leaders, I don't know if you're a political person, how many political leaders do you think you can name in the United States? How many? 7. Okay. Some. But I would say we're in Washington, and so you're next to Washington, you get kind of a little infected with the political disease. But the average American cannot name 10 political figures. Americans know who their president is. My guess, an open question, who's the vice president, you probably get 70% who know. Maybe Secretary of State, it goes down to 50%. Secretary of Defense, can you name the Secretary of Defense? You're going to be in the margin of error of 0. And then you say, well, who's in the Senate? We just had it. You just had an election, so people are focusing on figures. If you ask them 6 months from now to name a couple of senators, it would be hard. You'd be hard-pressed to get to 10. I defy you to go to Israel and to find a single Israeli who couldn't rattle off the names of 20 political figures in Israel. Won't happen. And even though we have a Knesset, the last Knesset has 48 new faces out of the 120, believe me, 30, 40, 50 of the old faces, people will rattle off. Even though they'll tell you, I don't really know, and then they'll start naming 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know why? Because in America, you have Hollywood and you have politics. In Israel, politics is Hollywood. The politicians are the country's celebrities. And the reason why is because politics matters. You know, when the first interview I ever gave in Israel was to the Jerusalem Post, and I think it was around 1996, 1997. And I said, my vision for Israel is that one day turnout rates in Israel would be what they are in America. And at that point, turnout rates were heading down, and they were very low, and they looked like they were going to keep going down. You actually had an election in the United States in 1996. The big issues of the day were midnight basketball and school uniforms in a presidential election. And turnout rates were dropping and dropping. And I said, yeah, one day I'd like to see turnout. You know why? Because people said, sort of a little bit appalled by what I said, and said, well, it's an affront to democracy, and you have to have civic participation. I get all that. But the truth of the matter is, when politics is so important, it means that the country is not secure, is not prosperous, is not necessarily stable. Politics should not take up this oversized chunk of your life. In a lot of countries, people don't go to vote. You know why? Because it just doesn't matter. And the situation in Israel 20 years ago, which is slightly different today, was that a slight change in Israeli society, if 2 seats of the Knesset would shift one way or another, the whole country would change. All of the country's history would change. And some may think that's a very good thing. I don't. I think it's a source of great concern. And when politics matters, even when there are low turnouts, people go and vote. I remember when David Duke ran for governor of Louisiana. And that was a time when people were not coming out to vote. They came out in droves to make sure that he would not be governor of the state of Louisiana, because then people cared. Then it mattered to not have that man serve as governor. But otherwise, when you have high turnout rates, it means people are worried about the future. It means that everything hangs in the balance. And I hope that Israel actually will one day be in a situation of prosperity, peace, and everything else that a lot of countries take for granted, so that our politicians are no longer celebrities, and that we actually have celebrities in Israel who are not the defense minister or the prime minister or the minister of that or the minister of this. Now, the other thing is, Israel has something of a no-holds-barred political culture. As bad as you think your politics are and as vicious as you think it is, you guys, you're in politics 101. Vicious politics 101, I should say. We are an advanced 505 in Israel. And I learned this the first time when the first time I came to Israel. I was there a month. I was exercising in this gym, and I was on a treadmill, and I'm watching then Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I didn't know at the time. And he was being interviewed by 3 people. Sheli Yachimovich was a journalist who went on to become the leader of the Labor Party in Israel. Tommy Lapid, a journalist who went on to become the leader of another party in Israel, if you understand the hint. And the third was Amnon Dankner, who I don't think has any political aspirations as far as I know. But these 3 people were interviewing the prime minister in one of these holiday-like interviews. And I was on the treadmill, and somebody was watching the television next to me on another treadmill. And the prime minister starts answering, and in the middle of his answer, they cut him off. And I turned to the guy and said, well, she's fired. And the guy says, welcome to Israel. I could not believe that you could cut off a president or a prime minister in mid-sentence. That was just not done. And you remember a few years ago when President Obama was speaking at the State of the Union, and Congressman Wilson shouted out, you lie. And people were appalled because it was a total breach of American etiquette that you would do. Okay, that's true. We were sitting back in the prime minister's office. And I said to one of my colleagues, look, if I could get the prime minister into and out of our Knesset with only one guy calling him a liar, and that's all they'd call him, they would give me the Israel Prize. Now, It means that when you're studying Israel from the outside, you have to understand it's a very rambunctious political culture, and they hurl all sorts of accusations one at another. And sometimes that's kind of plucked out and quoted abroad, losing the context and losing a sense that the political culture is very different. What would be totally over the line in the United States is just par for the course in Israel. And unfortunately, sometimes some things are said. Some things were said this summer, which sort of crossed the line about your Secretary of State, that were in part of Israel's rambunctious debate. All sorts of things can be said. Have to understand this big cultural difference. And I tried my best to explain the cultural differences, but there are things that should never be said on both sides between allies. But what you should remember about Israel, how many people here have been to a Friday night meal? Okay, so I got a good... It's a Friday night meal argument to the 100th power. That's Israeli politics. So understand the unique dynamic that you have in Israel. Now, the third thing and final thing is a deep sense of solidarity that there is in Israel that you don't see in many other countries. Now, I don't think that that's something that should be taken for granted, or it's not something that should be self-evident. Israel is an extremely diverse society. So people talk about we're 75% Jewish majority in Israel and about 25% non-Jewish. Most of them are Arab Muslims. There are also Arab Christians. And there are other smaller groups within Israel. That's true. But the diversity within the Jewish population of Israel is huge. You've got Jews from 100 different countries around the world. So to think that automatically you're going to snap your fingers with a young country and have that sense of solidarity is not, as I said, self-evident. We are a 66-year-old country, but we're a 4,000-year-old people. And we are a real nation. Part of the problem that you have in the Middle East today is you don't have real countries in the Middle East. Here's another tip. If there's a straight line on a map that's not a river, it probably means a European put it there. You don't have a lot of real nations in the Middle East. Egypt is a real nation. You have real tribes with real histories and real cultures and a real heritage, but not necessarily states. And in the Middle East, what you're seeing happening today is a collapse of a 100-year order that was put in place after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which basically people drew lines on a map and put peoples together that aren't necessarily real peoples, or their sub-identities, their tribal identity, their sect identity is far more superior than any national identity that you have. But the Jewish people are a real people and a real nation with a real history, and that's one of the reasons why I think we have this connection, even though we've been from 100 different countries. And even though from the countries of the Arab world, from Ethiopia, from the former Soviet Union, from Europe, from America, from South America, all these Jewish communities have come home, each with a different past, but somehow in Israel, because of the unique society that we have, we've been able to forge this tremendous sense of solidarity, and there is a sense of shared destiny. How many people know what percentage of the world's Jews lived in Israel when Israel was established in 1948? It's either double jeopardy or final jeopardy. Take a guess. Is a courageous man. How much? 18%. You would, on The Price is Right, you're high, and so you'd go over. You wouldn't get credit for it. 2%. You'd be good on The Price is Right. You wouldn't be right, but you'd be in the money. When Israel was established, 5% of the world's Jews lived in Israel. 2% before the Holocaust. There were 18 million Jews in the world before the Holocaust. 6 million were killed. So we lost a third of our people. Now that's the equivalent of over 100 million Americans. That's a tough number to get your mind around, so imagine a 9/11 every day for a century. That's what the Holocaust did to the Jewish people. That's what it means to lose a third of your people. We had 12 million Jews in the world. 600,000 were in Israel the day it was established. My mother was one of them. 5% of the world's Jews. Today, Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world. Over 43, 44% of the world's Jews. Number one, past the United States. By the way, New York is still the largest Jewish city in the world. Haven't passed that, neither Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. But there is a sense in this coming home of a shared also a destiny because of this tremendous change. But there are a couple of other things that I want to point out that makes the Israeli experience, I think, so unique and that people don't understand. First is the army. Israel is a citizens' army. Democracies in the world do not have citizens' armies anymore, not with a draft. Most democracies don't. You can have this or that example. But virtually all of Israeli society, and the numbers, I think, going to grow in the future as we bring other parts of Israeli society into the army, have this very powerful experience, which is a great equalizer in Israeli society. It doesn't matter where you're from. You go into the army and you really get your chance. Our MITs are in the army. Our top universities are in the army. As everyone goes in there and as different agencies compete with the best and the brightest, and everybody all of a sudden gets a chance. No matter where they come from, no matter what their socioeconomic background, they might decide to go into fighting units, they may decide to go into intelligence, they may decide to go into somewhere else. But that experience of the army is something that creates a deep, shared sense of solidarity in the country. And it comes up especially when there are attacks against our army, when there are accusations made against the army, as there were this summer, despite everything. And I don't want to go through all the arguments, but let me just say this. Israelis don't have to read a report to find out what happened in the war. We are not fighting wars by remote control thousands of miles away. If Israelis want to know what happened in the war, they ask their father, their son, their daughter, their brother, their sister around the Friday night dinner table. They'll ask them what happened, and that's how they'll know. So when you libel Israel's army, you are libeling the people of Israel. And it's always important to remember, because we are a people's army. And that gives us a powerful sense. And the last point is this powerful sense is also, I think, pushed by and fueled by the media in Israel. Israelis are media junkies. The top 3 television programs in Israel get about 40% of the Israeli public to watch it. In the United States, you don't get to 10%. Israelis literally are plugged in all the time to the news. They're constantly watching the evening news. Every hour, on the hour, a beep, 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 beep. Those of you who have been in Israel, all of a sudden the radio reporters come in. People, a lot of times, will listen for 3 or 4 minutes to the news. And what it means, because of that, because everybody is listening, and because it's national media, you know, a car crash that kills somebody is not a national story in the United States. It is in Israel. It means that we experience things together as a nation. There are very few events that Americans experience together as a nation. 9/11 was one of those events. A Super Bowl. Maybe an election. Certainly a dramatic election like in 2008, where there is a shared a sense of solidarity. But they're very, very few. Maybe it happens once or twice a year. In Israel, it's every single day, which frankly makes Israel the most exciting place on earth, because the whole country is strapped in to this roller coaster. There are ups and there are downs, and there are a lot of twists and turns, but Israelis have a very powerful sense of being in this roller coaster ride that we have in Israel together. And just to know how exciting Israel is as a country, Israelis go to Manhattan to unwind. That's how tense the place is. So my conclusion is, how many people here have been to Israel? Big hand, big group. Well, if you've been to Israel, then certainly go. And you know, if you've been to Israel, that life there is measured in dog years. If you spend a day in Israel, you feel like you've been there a week, and a week is about 2 months. And I have to tell you, working in the Prime Minister's office is dog years of dog years. So I may look young, but I feel like I'm about 420 after 4 years in the Prime Minister's office. But if you haven't been there, go and experience this unbelievable ride that you have in Israel. And I would ask all of you who are studying Israeli society, as you're looking into what's happening with Iran and what's happening in the peace process, and you'll have time to ask me any of the questions you want to ask, remember the 3 things I told you in thinking about Israel. Remember how important its size is. Remember the unique political culture that we have in Israel. And remember the deep sense of solidarity that exists in Israel. A powerful sense both of a shared past, a shared experience in the present, and a great sense of a very, very brilliant future. Thank you.
So who's going to ask the first question?
Fire away.
Please. Introduce yourself.
For 50 days this summer, we saw Hamas rain rockets down on Israeli cities. About a month after the war, we saw Israel begin to ease some of the restrictions on the blockade of Gaza. This included re-allowing entry of construction materials, allowing students to attend universities in the West Bank, and easing restrictions on Gaza fishermen. My question, Mr. Ambassador, is the following. Is the only way for Palestinians to see improvements in their livelihood going to be through shooting rockets at Israel? Is Hamas the only Palestinian player that the Israeli government is willing to respond to? Thank you.
Well, I don't agree with the premise of your question. Israel basically restored a situation that existed before. Israel has had, as I said, thousands and thousands, not just 4,000 this summer. I can assure you that other countries would have responded with considerably greater force than Israel responded. We have no desire to have a conflict with the Palestinians. We have no desire to have a conflict with Hamas. We left every square inch of that territory. And we uprooted, as I said when I spoke, we uprooted the settlements. We took 10,000 people out of their homes. We left greenhouses and agricultural equipment. James Wolfenson, who was the president of the World Bank at the time, actually mobilized a lot of Jews to invest millions of dollars to give the Palestinians a chance to build a different future. And people were talking at the time that maybe there'd be a Singapore in the Middle East. And there's no reason to believe that if you didn't have a turn towards terror, that you wouldn't have had a completely different situation in Gaza. But instead what happened is that Gaza basically was taken over by Hamas, a military coup against the Palestinian Authority. They threw a lot of them off the top of buildings and killed a lot of Palestinian Authority officials. And Gaza got turned into a military base to be used against Israel. And all the money and all the aid, instead of going to build schools and hospitals and to improve Palestinian lives, went to basically fuel Hamas's military machine. I mean, you saw those tunnels on television, how much concrete was put into those tunnels, these terror tunnels that were designed for one purpose. They weren't to make peace with Israel. They were designed to actually pop out on the other side, to infiltrate Israeli territory, and to massacre our civilians. That's what the purpose of, and to fire all these rockets. Hamas is a party, it's important to understand. They're an organization that is committed to the destruction of Israel, and they are also a genocidal terror organization. They are committed to the murder of Jews worldwide by their charter. It's not what I say, it's what they say. And unfortunately, the people of Gaza basically are held hostage by this organization. How many of them agree with them or don't agree with them, I don't know. But after the war, or in the waning days, a lot of Gazans protested against Hamas, and they were killed, and they were shot. What happened today when 3 people left, you can't put a sign like that in Gaza, you'll get shot. In Israel, you don't get shot for protesting. In Gaza, you do. And so these people, the Palestinians in Gaza, are suffering under this. Israel doesn't want to fight them. We don't want to have to take out missile batteries. We want to see Gaza have a better future. And when they have a leadership that wants to lead them into that future, I think we'll be in a much better place. Now, what happened after the war, your specific questions, is we restored fishing rights that they had before. And we restored different things that had existed before, and they didn't achieve their goals. What they wanted to do, and their goal was to break what they call the siege around Gaza. Now, we don't prevent goods, materials from flowing into Gaza, but they want a port, and they want an airport, and they want sort of an outlet to the world that will not be inspected. And the problem we have is they will use that port to build a military machine that will make what we face in the summer child's play. When the Palestinians make the turn, when Hamas, if ever they would make the turn towards peace with Israel, they will have a willing partner. Understand something, and a broader question. Whenever Israel has faced an Arab partner who wanted peace and who spoke peace, Israel made peace. It didn't matter who the leader of Israel was at the time. Menachem Begin was the leader of the Likud party. When he came to power, everyone was talking about what a hardliner he was. When he faced Sadat, he made peace, and he paid a very big price for that peace. So did Sadat. But we gave up territory that's twice the size of Israel in order to achieve it. Made a huge compromise for peace. And of course, with Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein, it was the same thing. You didn't have a huge territorial compromise in that case, but we made peace. The second you have a Palestinian leader that is actually prepared to make peace, to end the conflict with Israel, who wants to establish a Palestinian state not to continue the conflict, but to end the conflict, and is willing to recognize, just as they want us to recognize their right to have a nation state and self-determination as Palestinians, to recognize the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our homeland. When we have that mutual recognition and we have the security arrangements we need so that in case something happens, we have the protection we need, then we'll be able to make peace.
Thank you. Yes, please. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is William. I'm a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Linguistics. So I have just one point and then a question. You just mentioned that Israeli leadership always was willing to negotiate with a partner who was willing to make peace. But I'd like to refute that with Anwar Sadat's offer in 1971 of a full peace treaty to Israel just for the return of the occupied Sinai, which was captured, and then it was rebuffed by the Israeli government. And then only then, of course, later that Israel accepted the same peace terms that Sadat had offered back in 71. So that's just a clarification in your previous point. I also have a question. I mean, I understand the need for Israel's security. It's completely legitimate. Israel is a small country. Those are very rational points, but Palestine is even smaller of a country. And so obviously Palestinians have their own right for self-determination and for security. So in that sense, should they also not have a right to a buffer zone? I mean, according to your logic, shouldn't they be asking for even more territory to be associated with a Palestinian state to ensure their security, when obviously there have been multiple incursions and violence continually against the Palestinians? So according to that logic, shouldn't that not apply to Palestine?
Yeah, two problems. First of all, the history we're not going to get into of what happened with Egypt, and I disagree with your assessment of what happened in 1971. Let me just deal with the second point. We don't threaten the Palestinians with annihilation. That's the difference. We never have. The criticism of Israel that was offered at the United Nations by the leader of the Palestinians, President Abbas, accusing Israel of genocide, is an outrage. Palestinian population in the West Bank is about 4 times what it was in 1967. And we're accused of genocide. We never said that we were trying to annihilate the Palestinian people. No Israeli prime minister, no serious Israeli leader has ever had such a policy. The problem that we have with the Palestinians is Hamas is openly committed to our destruction. There's not a parallel there. And the problem with President Abbas is he has not resorted to violence, although what he's done in recent days is very problematic because he has incited to violence. He has not confronted the part of the Palestinian population that is committed to the destruction of Israel. And in Palestinian textbooks and in their media, you see incitement that is rampant and wild. And you don't see that on the Israeli side. You know, if all of a sudden Israel laid down its arms, there'd be no Israel. And on the Palestinian side, if they stop their violence towards Israel and they recognize Israel's right of self-determination as a nation state for the Jewish people, recognize our history in the land. They don't have to accept my narrative, but they don't think that the Jews are a people. Arafat went to Camp David and he said there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. We're talking about the Temple Mount with a background. Arafat said that to President Clinton, and somebody at Jerusalem at the time told me, I don't know if Arafat believes that or doesn't believe it, and I don't know what's worse. But there's a denial of the connection of the Jewish people to that land. A denial that the Jews are a people, because to accept that the Jews are a people, to accept they have a connection to the land, is to accept that the Jews have a right of self-determination. Now, in Israel, there's been a crossing of the Rubicon. When the Prime Minister spoke at Bar Ilan University and he said he is for a solution of 2 states for 2 peoples, where a demilitarized Palestinian state, because of the security issues I mentioned, would recognize the Jewish state of Israel, a nation state for the Jewish people, mutual recognition. That was a crossing of the Rubicon. The problem is you have not had a crossing of the Rubicon on the Palestinian side. There's not a recognition of the Jewish people's right to be in that land. The Palestinian narrative is essentially, we're foreign colonialists, we stole their land. That's the narrative. My hope for peace, and I am actually optimistic about the prospects of one day having peace, is that it's a false narrative. We do have a connection to the land. You can read about that connection in almost any hotel room in the United States. We have a history in the land. We're not a made-up people. You know, to deny the connection between the Jewish people and the Jewish land is absurd, but it happens. Because if the Palestinians would accept that there is a connection, I'm not asking them change what happened in 48, change what happened in 67. I'm not asking them to make that jump, and I don't think that's going to happen for a very long time. But once they recognize that we are a people with a connection to that land, they're basically saying they have a right and you have a right. Now let's figure out how we can work out an arrangement. If they're trapped in the idea is you stole our house and you have no right to be here, you'll never be able to achieve peace. We have actually accepted the idea. There's a people in this land, the Palestinians. We want to find an accommodation with them. We want to find an accommodation that's real, that's genuine. And when the Israeli people know that on the other side they have somebody who wants to find a genuine accommodation and recognizes their right also to be there, by right, not because we're powerful, not because we have a powerful army, but by right, that we have a history in this place. When the Israeli people see that on the Palestinian side, you will see a wave of peace that will make what happened in the Oslo period pale by comparison.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Two young Israelis moved from Israel to Berlin, of all places.
The Milky case.
Right. And the premise for the move was because of the disparity in income between younger people and the haves, and talking about how much easier it was and how more affordable it was in various places in Europe. Do you see that as an aberration, or is that a trend that's worrisome?
Well, I don't think it's a trend necessarily of people leaving Israel. The response to a lot of Israelis were not maybe what people had thought who had launched this campaign. I do think the high cost of living is a serious challenge for Israel. We had an election in Israel a year and a half ago, okay? And we have all this stuff happening in the region, and Syria, and the Palestinian issue, of course, and Iran racing ahead to develop nuclear weapons. The biggest issue in the Israeli election a year and a half ago was the price of cottage cheese. I'm not making this up. I said to the Prime Minister that night, maybe you can take some comfort in the fact that you've kept this country safe and secure, that the biggest issue would be the price of cottage cheese. I don't think the biggest issue in Israel is the price of cottage cheese, but that's an issue that is very important for Israelis because of the high cost of living in Israel. It's a real challenge. We have 2/3 of the salaries that you have in the United States, the level, and the cost of housing is triple. The major housing and the major problem in the cost of living in Israel is actually the cost of housing. And there are many reasons why that is, and I actually think that that's a problem that can be solved. I mean, Israel, I think, owns a greater percentage of its land. The government owns a greater percentage of its land than any country besides North Korea. And when the Prime Minister tried to actually free up some of these lands, to actually get building going and to increase his supply, he faced a huge political challenge from both the right and the left. The right said, if you're going to sell off land, you'll have, Arab sheiks coming in and buying up our national lands. And the left said it would go all the way to the fat cats in Israel. There were big problems. And I'm not going to get into what exactly is the right way to solve it, but the Israeli people, and you saw those social protest movements 2 or 3 years ago, they want to see a serious reduction in the cost of living in Israel because it's very hard, and because they have also big families. Israel, I didn't mention it, but Israel has the highest growth rate, natural growth rate in the industrialized world. Israelis are about almost 3 children per woman in Israel, which I think the United States is about 2. A lot of European countries, it's closer to 1, and their populations are actually imploding because of that. And it's not just the ultra-Orthodox that sometimes can have 8 or 9 kids. It's an average Israeli family. Many secular Israelis, it's very common for them to have 3 or 4 kids. You know, I'm doing my part for the demographic battle with 5. But my wife it tells me the difference is when you tell somebody in Israel you have 5 kids, they say, okay, call me when you get 7. And when she tells people here she has 5, the number one comment she gets is, are you done yet? Are you done yet? So we have this growing population, large families, wanting to reduce the cost of living. And I think one of the reasons why people focus on them is there's not that optimism right now that maybe peace is around the corner. And they see the great security challenges that they face, and they say, well, here's a problem that we should be able to resolve. And I think we can by freeing up lands, by having more building, by dealing with monopolies and cartels that actually lower the raise the cost of living in Israel. And that's a real challenge, and I hope that the next election, you know what, actually, I do hope that the next election will be only about the price of cottage cheese. It would mean that we're safer and more secure than otherwise would be. I'm afraid that it might not be the big issue in the next elections.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. So Joe is the first one, and Amna will be the second, and we'll have to finish with that. Here, the first row.
My question deals with Iran and the current
That's
negotiations.
small little issue.
I think that is the overarching evil. Would you comment on the current negotiations and what Israel could accept or not accept?
Okay. It is the most important issue and the most serious threat. And we think it's not only a threat to us, it's clear they openly committed to our destruction. And you hear those wild things coming from Tehran all the time. It's a great threat and perceived as a great threat in the Arab world and certainly throughout the world. Now, what Iran wants to do is very simple. Iran wants to remove the sanctions against it and keep their nuclear program essentially intact. That's what they want to do. And they have a nuclear program. Anyone who doesn't believe that they have a nuclear program is I think should be living in something of an alternative universe. They've got thousands and thousands of centrifuges where they enrich uranium. Just by way of comparison, I think Pakistan built their nuclear weapon with maybe 6,000 centrifuges. Today, Iran has 19,000 centrifuges. They have underground enrichment facilities. They have a heavy water facility, which is a plutonium route to a bomb. And they have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, only in cartoons do you put TNT on ICBMs, when Wile E. Coyote shoots it up into outer space. In the real world, you put nuclear payloads on ICBMs. There's no other reason to develop ICBMs. So when Iran is continuing with its ICBM program, that, ladies and gentlemen, is not a smoking gun, it's a smoking missile. This tells you what they want. But they have a problem, Iran, is that they were facing these very, very powerful sanctions against them. Now, sanctions against Iran have been around for a long time. They've been effective for only 2 years, really since the beginning of 2012. And they were very effective. It was $100 billion in about 18 months. Now, Iran is a $500 billion economy. I don't know who studies finance here, but you don't need to be such a financial maven to understand that that's completely unsustainable. So they're rushing to the negotiating table to get the international community to reduce these pressures that are taking such a huge chunk out of their economy, and they want to remove those sanctions and to leave the program essentially intact. And Israel's position is very simple. We say, look, Iran, we know, wants a nuclear weapons program. They don't have a peaceful program. But in order to convince the last European diplomat that their program is only peaceful, let them have what they need for a peaceful program, but nothing else. And here's what people don't know. They don't need a single centrifuge to have a peaceful nuclear energy program. There are 17 countries around the world, including your northern neighbor, Canada, your southern neighbor, Mexico, including a Muslim country like Indonesia. They have peaceful nuclear energy. They don't have a single centrifuge. They don't need centrifuges. They don't need a heavy water facility. They don't need this bunker in the side of a mountain, and they certainly don't need ICBMs. So we say if you're leaving them with a peaceful nuclear program, then fine, but don't leave them with anything else. And the concern that we have is that the international community is going to lead them with a very advanced program with thousands of centrifuges, thousands and thousands of centrifuges. And the way that they will bridge the gap is to try to do this with inspectors and intelligence. And there's a real problem for us in that, because our intelligence is not perfect. Your intelligence is not perfect. Been wrong many times before with intelligence. And we didn't know for years about a couple of Iran's secret nuclear facilities. So what makes us think that we're going to know in time to take action against these facilities if you leave them with this vast infrastructure? And the second thing is inspectors. I don't know about you, but I don't feel that comfortable if the only thing between a bunch of fanatical ayatollahs that call for my destruction and nuclear weapons is a few of the UN's Inspector Clouseaus. That doesn't make me feel so comfortable. So we say in Israel, the best thing that you should do is to keep ratcheting up the pressure. The only way that you can peacefully resolve this problem, and no one has more to gain than Israel if this issue is resolved peacefully. If Iran's nuclear weapons program is dismantled peacefully, no country has more to gain than Israel. But the only way that's going to happen is if you put Iran in a choice between the potential collapse of their economy, and which could be a problem for the regime, and their program. If that's the choice they face, they'll give up their program. Without it, they'll want to keep it. And what we don't want to see the world do is leave Iran as a threshold nuclear power, a short distance away, remove all those sanctions. They're a short distance away today. So people will say, okay, let them take a few steps back. But there's a difference between today, where they're a short step away from at least the fissile material necessary for a weapon, and they're facing this wall of sanctions, to them being another couple steps back and not facing any sanctions. Then you'd be leaving them as a threshold nuclear power, and sooner or later, they will get a weapon. And that is catastrophic for Israel. It's catastrophic for the region. It could actually lead to a nuclear arms race in the most dangerous place on the planet. All of a sudden, you're going to see many, many nuclear powers emerge. A lot of countries have already said they're going to do it. The Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, other countries say they will do it. And so this is a deep concern. And, you know, somebody in business who I met, who's a very smart businessman, a billionaire, he said, my principle in business is very simple. I never take the smallest risk of catastrophic consequences. Israel is a country in living memory of a Holocaust. And we have a regime in Iran that openly calls for Israel's destruction. Israel cannot take the smallest risk of catastrophic consequences. That's why we have the position that we have. And I hope that the world, the international community, will stand firm, not make a bad deal that would be dangerous for Israel, dangerous for the region, and ultimately dangerous for the United States. Remember, we're the little Satan. You're the great Satan. Europe gets aggravated because they're only a middle-sized Satan. But you're the great Satan. You're the ones ultimately who they're confronting.
Thank you. And the last question by a student minor in Israel Studies, please.
They know everything. They don't have to ask a question.
Well, let's see.
We will see.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I really appreciate it. Kind of on that, you talked a lot about Israel's security and Israel's security concerns. And once that Israel gets a partner for peace, that concern will be alleviated. But I actually wanted to ask you about a letter that 106 ex-IDF generals and Mossad officials and security chiefs from the IDF and Israel's various security agencies sent to Prime Minister Netanyahu about pursuing peace negotiations with President Abbas because of the occupation, the threat that the occupation poses to Israel's status as a democratic state. And so I was wondering if you could address that and kind of what the letter talked about. And the bigger question is that while we're talking about all these very real security concerns, Hamas and Iran, what about the occupation and the threat that poses to Israel's status? Because I think that if Israel stopped existing as a democratic state, that would also be a catastrophic consequence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, understand that Israel is, as I said before, a very open, very democratic society. A lot of people have a lot of different opinions in Israel. But ultimately, there is one person who bears the responsibility for the security of the country. You know, when your president was had to make a decision whether or not to take out bin Laden, some of the leading people in your government thought it wasn't a good idea, and he made the decision he had to make because he bears ultimate responsibility. And the Prime Minister bears the ultimate responsibility. And what the Prime Minister sees, no one else sees. And what the Prime Minister knows, no one else knows. I realized that when I was in the Prime Minister's office, and he bears this responsibility like no one else does. So the fact that you could get a group of Israelis who could say almost anything, because we're not a monolithic people. See, people are not used to it. Because among our enemies, you don't see that. Because they have no right to dissent. That's the difference. I'm waiting to see the Palestinian peace camp emerge. I'm waiting to see protests. You can't see it. I don't blame them. Certainly not in Gaza, because they can get shot for their views. But you don't have monolithic societies. So if you look at Israel as being a monolithic society, and all of a sudden you've got 100 people who said this, or 5 people who said this, or 50 people who said that, you says, wow, it's not. We're a country of 8 million people. 1% of 8 million people is how many? 80,000. A tenth of that is 8,000. Another tenth of that is 800. So you give me a letter of 100 people, I can give you a letter of 100 people of almost anything in Israeli society, and to take almost any position in Israeli society. What I've seen is that the bulk of Israeli population is pretty much in a place where they would love to be in a position where they were able to resolve their conflict with the Palestinians. And they'd be willing to pay, I think, a very high price in order to do it. And as I've said, they've shown that they're willing to pay a high price that other countries have not paid. And I didn't say that when you have a partner, you won't have the security problems. On the contrary, the security problem will exist in Israel even if we had a partner tomorrow. We have to have security arrangements that if that partner who we could sign an agreement with tomorrow, how do I know that that's going to percolate down into Palestinian society? Given what they're teaching in their schools, given what they're teaching their kids, given the rampant incitement that we have day after day, I'm not confident that a Palestinian leader who makes a peace with us will actually make a sea change among the Palestinian public. And that's why Israel needs the security arrangements. Once that leader crosses the Rubicon, which is going to be critical to recognize mutual recognition, a nation state for you and a nation state for us, that's the first step. But after that, we have to have those security arrangements on the ground to protect the peace and to protect Israel if the peace unravels. We're very close to each other. Now, I think the vast majority of Israelis today are deeply concerned with the idea of a withdrawal without actually seeing a real change on the other side of heart and the real security on the ground. Now, as for your question about the occupation, not the occupation, look, Israel doesn't want to govern the Palestinians. We don't want the Palestinians as subjects. Most of the Palestinians govern themselves. That's not to say that there are not restrictions on different things, because we have a unique security environment. But we don't want to govern them. We want them to govern themselves, to have political independence. And when the Prime Minister gives his speech at Bar-Ilan University, that's what he was talking about. But we can't dismiss these security concerns as not being real. We can't just hope for the best. Can't close our eyes and say, okay, it happened in Lebanon that you left and went back to the 67 line. And yeah, sure, they put 100,000 rockets and they fired a few thousand at the north. And it happened in Gaza. And they're calling for your destruction. And they're accusing you, the leader of the moderate Palestinians is accusing you at the UN of genocide, of wild crimes that you commit, that you didn't. We can't just sort of dismiss that and say we'll walk out and we'll hope for the best. The burden on the shoulders of the Prime Minister of Israel is, I think, unlike the burden on the shoulders of any single leader around the world. Because he not only has to represent 8 million citizens of Israel and secure them, he also carries on him the dreams of 100 generations of his people to return to the land of Israel. 100 generations who dream that. And 3 have had the privilege of living in Israel, living that dream. He can't afford to make a mistake, not even if 106 people tell him to make a mistake. He's got to do what is necessary to secure our future. And I have full faith and confidence that no matter what pressures may be brought to bear, internal or external, he'll continue to do what he has to do in order to give Israel security. And ultimately, as I said before, I believe we'll have peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for your readiness to come and talk to us and join our very interesting series of lectures. Thank you for presenting so well your position and the position of the Prime Minister. It was quieter than the Israeli typical Friday evening discussion, but it was as deep and interesting. So thank you for all of you to come that came to the meeting.